benvenuto. Bye bye.
Grazie, grazie.
Mi scuso se sarei rimasto volentieri con voi, ma è una giornata molto complicata dal punto di vista della gestione dell'università, e quindi volevo prima di tutto ringraziare Massimo De Giuseppe per questo incontro che va in una direzione che io ho sempre auspicato, cioè che
un problema di audio.
Di audio, sì.
Sì, adesso forse ti sentiamo.
Ecco.
Sì.
Dicevo, una direzione che io ho sempre auspicato, cioè che l'università non si chiuda in modo autoreferenziale. Sì. Allora, dicevo, il fatto che l'università si apra anche a esaminare prodotti culturali di massa che sono sedimentati dentro l'immaginario collettivo, come il caso di una maschera come quella di Zorro, credo vada nella direzione giusta. No, io ho un eco terribile. Scusate, saluto, vi auguro buon lavoro, perché sia la mia posizione che non funziona. E quindi, scusatemi, buon lavoro da tutti. Va bene così, non perdiamo tempo, non riesco a ricollegare. Grazie, buon lavoro, grazie davvero. Ciao, 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 ciao.
Grazie Lorenzo. Thanks to Professor Gianni Canova, we had some little problem with the connection. And a short introduction of Stephen that, as I was saying before, we have known some years ago, 10 years ago, around in the Vatican archives, making some common investigation around the Mexican, post-revolutionary Mexico. And Stephen came from the University of Portland, like Macaulay passed from Portland for a short period of his life. And he was making, I think, his PhD in Oxford at that time with Alan Knight, another expert professor of Latin American history. And he is a very brilliant historian. He is author of various books. I remember a very important book that is about the Vatican, is sort of comparison between Chile and Mexico in some very complicated years. That was the 20s, the 30s, that were very important for the transnational history of Catholicism. Then I remember a very good book written with another friend, Julia Young, about the local church and global church in Latin America, and the connection with the Vatican, Second Vatican Council, and the transformation of activism, sociality, and political impact of Catholic action during the various decades, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. It finished with the Vatican's, the Second Council, and a recent work called The Mysterious Sophia alla Mexicana, that I haven't read, so I can't say much about this book, but I think it's another interesting story. So we're here because the last book, Zorro Shadow of Stephen, is a very interesting journey through the imaginary, the history, the roots, and the future of this particular character that is Zorro, worldwide known actor, very important also in the communication history of Italy. So I will leave the words to Stephen to start his presentation, and then I will return as a discussant to present a couple of answers, and I invite our students to participate to the discussion. Thank you and welcome here, virtually here in Milan. the microphone.
Yes. Okay. We're good. Grazie mille to you, Professor, and thank you so much for having me. Let me bring up my all right. So Massimo, just make sure that it is my screen, the slides showing.
Yes, we
okay.
can see Zorro
Okay.
from the page to the silver screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay. This is one of these situations, right, where I can't exactly see what you all are experiencing. So, but it sounds like it's working fine. So thank you so much to the university. Thank you to the rector, Canova, for having me. My name is Stephen Andes. I'm a professor here in the United States at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so for the last 2 years or so, I've set out to find the origins of Zorro. I read all the books by Johnston Macaulay, one of the pulp fiction author who wrote the first Zorro tale in 1919. I read the comics by individuals such as Toth and Kinsler, McGregor, Matt Wagner. I became a little obsessed, honestly. And so today I have about 30 minutes to share with you just some of what I learned. And of course, you can read the rest in the book, or we can talk more about it in the question and answer period. So what will we learn today? Well, I've divided this in 3 acts and then sort of a denouement, or sort of a sort of untangling of the narrative threads. In Act 1, we'll talk about Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, Hollywood's first power couple, how they gambled on love and costume adventure films. Act 2, we'll talk about the Mark of Zorro itself, the first live action film that came out in 1920, 100 years ago, almost to the day. It was November 1920. So this is good timing. And then Act 3, we'll talk about how Zorro actually laid a blueprint for the superhero, especially the comic book superhero genre within the United States. We'll talk about some influence on Superman and Batman. And then at the end, we'll talk about how all of this relates to the history of Latinx people, the history, especially the Latin American influence within the United States. Okay, so of course, we'll also hopefully talk about why Zorro matters. Why is Zorro important for us 100 years later, especially as Dr. De Giuseppe said, our current generation, maybe the generation of college students now, perhaps doesn't know as much about Zorro as I did when I was a kid, or Dr. De Giuseppe when he was a kid. But Zorro remains important, and I'll hopefully that will begin to make more sense as we end. So everyone has their favorite Zorro. For those of you who know about Zorro, everybody has their favorite Zorro. You could pick a specific actor, perhaps. For me, the Zorro that always comes to mind is Antonio Banderas from the 1998 film The Mask of Zorro, right, with Catherine Zeta-Jones. But for others, perhaps the Rector Canova perhaps thinks about the 1940 film, or the Guy Williams of Disney's Zorro in the 1950s. But actually, these Zorros were not the Zorro that started it off, right? We could also talk, of course, about the many European Zorro films that were made and their own actors. But the first actor to start it off was Douglas Fairbanks. He was a sort of Tom Cruise and Jackie Chan rolled up into one. He flitted, he strut, he did all of his own stunts. And in the 1920s, he had a string of action films. The Three Musketeers, Robin Hood, Thief of Baghdad, The Black Pirate, The Gaucho. But it all began in 1920 with Zorro. In fact, the 1920 Zorro films started off and set a radical new course for Fairbanks's own career. So much so that today he's really remembered for his role, especially in the 1920s in these action films, but especially the Mark of Zorro. Sorry, I see that I made a mistake. It should be The Mark of Zorro in 1920, not the Mask of Zorro. That was the 1998 film. But why? Why did he decide to do Zorro in 1920? From hindsight, it seems like an obvious choice, but not from the perspective of 1920. From the perspective of 1920, most costume adventures set in historical times actually flopped. And Fairbanks was actually known for his sort of romantic comedies, so-called suit and tie comedies and romance films before the 1920s. For instance, one of those was called The Mollycoddle, where he plays a wimp, right, who finds his true sort of manliness, his masculinity, his true metal out west, right, formed in an American quote-unquote character found out west. Perhaps it's a little bit of a rehearsal for the kind of Don Diego alter ego for Zorro that he would later play. But anyway, from the perspective of 1920, it wasn't a given, one, that Fairbanks would do action films, and two, that he would be successful in action films, because everything up until then, the market, the economics of movies at the time, except for, the incredibly racist film, The Birth of a Nation in 1915 from D.W. Griffiths, most films in Hollywood at the time weren't these sort of large costume adventures, because they took a lot of money to make and they couldn't pay it off at the box office. But that's also not taking into account that Fairbanks himself wasn't the only one that made this decision. Fairbanks actually had a partner who was actually a more savvy business person than Fairbanks himself, and that was Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford was the other part of the equation, right? Today in the United States, we have this sort of fascination with Hollywood power couples, right? Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, the sort of portmanteau of Brangelina or Bennifer, right? Well, before the Brangelinas and the Bennifers, there was Pickfair, right? Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, who were married, and then they established one of the first large homes in Beverly Hills that they called Pickfair, sort of a combination of their two names. But just so you're not confused here, Mary Pickford in 1920 was more famous than Douglas Fairbanks. Mary Pickford was really the first Hollywood superstar. She was the first actress to sign $1 million contract, which in today's United States dollars, USD, works out to be about $43 million. They met in 1915, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, when Fairbanks moved from New York out to Hollywood. He had been on Broadway, and he moved out to Hollywood to try to make it big in California. Pickford, though, had been there since 1910. She was one of the first to make a foray out to the West with D.W. Griffith in 1910. So in 1915, when they both met, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were both married, but to other people. They were both married to other people at the time. So after Pickford's death in the 1970s, a chest of Mary Pickford's letters were found. And in those letters, there were actually love letters from Douglas Fairbanks to Mary Pickford. And among them, you can see sort of the head over heels way in which Douglas Fairbanks fell for Mary Pickford. In one letter, he wrote, "A mere thought of you stimulates as nothing else can. You have grown sweeter, lovelier, bigger. I can't tell you how thrilled I am at all times. Your intelligence, your beauty, your kindness, your sense of justice. Oh, I am wild about you," he said in this letter. So it seems their relationship began when they were selling war bonds together, right? And you can see in one of these pictures up at the top here, Charlie Chaplin, right? And the guy with the hat is D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks. They actually sold war bonds together. Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks were sort of best friends forever, BFFs. And in 1919, all four of them started a production company together, United Artists. And at the same time, they both divorced their partners and gasped they remarried each other, right? It was actually just a matter of weeks between when Mary Pickford got her divorce and when she was remarried to Douglas Fairbanks, right? That might sound like old sort of normal Hollywood behavior, right? But not in 1920, right? In 1920, on-screen personas were supposed to follow the actors off-screen. And so Mary was America's sweetheart. Douglas Fairbanks was the smiling all-American guy. And so the gamble first was, if they were to marry each other, would they lose their fan base? They were married, and then they went off on a honeymoon to Europe. And it seems that their gamble paid off, because in Europe, everybody freaked out and went wild about Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford together, right? It was almost as if the story that began to be spun in the press was they just want to be happy. We want Mary Pickford to be happy. She wasn't happy before. We want her to be happy. And for instance, in London, so many people were mobbing Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks that Fairbanks had to sort of, take Mary in his arms and jostle her through the crowd to make sure that she would be safe. So the world went mad about Doug and Mary. On their way home from their honeymoon, it seems that Mary was sent a Pulp Fiction serialized story called The Curse of Capistrano. And this was sent by one of her agents, right, to read scripts about what potential property they could buy, intellectual properties to make a movie. Mary read it. Douglas did not read it. And Mary read it and said, "Douglas, you need to buy it." And before Douglas Fairbanks had even read Curse of Capistrano, he telegraphed to buy the property. And then on his way home, he was like, "Okay, well, what have I bought?" And that's when he read The Curse of Capistrano, which was what we know today is the Mark of Zorro. And that's how Zorro was born, right? Basically, Mary Pickford said that Douglas Fairbanks should buy it, and he did. So the Mark of Zorro, as we move into thinking about the movie itself in 1920, the Mark of Zorro turns 100 years old this fall. On November 29th, 1920, the silent film debuted in New York City to throngs of clamoring patrons. And you can see a couple of these photos here from the opening. Hundreds, if not thousands, crammed around the Capitol Theater in New York City. And the movie absolutely blew viewers away, right? Here, let me turn down the sound here. And you can see some of the clips of the action sequences here. The movie blew viewers away, right? With its mix of daring do stunts and romance. Zorro's filmic premiere provided fantasy and escapism at a time when many Americans, and in fact the world over, were sorely in need of these fantasy and escapism. As we know, World War I, the First World War, had just ended, and in its wake came the Great Influenza, a global pandemic of which all of us are, of course, acutely aware of what that means to some extent. It had taken the lives and soured the horizons of millions, both war and influenza. Perhaps it does sound familiar to us at present. We find ourselves still in the grips of global pandemic and looking ahead to surges in cases happening. In the United States, many of us were looking ahead to the November general elections with perhaps a bit of fear and dread, even though it seems like things went a little better than we had hoped. So we'd all like a little fantasy and escape, and that's what Zorro really provided for viewers in 1920, and why a costume adventure film ended up succeeding then when it hadn't before. But here's the important question. Why should we care about the Mark of Zorro on its 100th anniversary? The movie certainly made a splash. It heralded the rise of the action adventure genre. Really, it's one of the first of its kind. We think of today, right, the action adventure genre, but this really gets its inauguration in 1920 in its popularity, in its ubiquity, right? The way that it traveled, not just in the United States, but abroad, throughout Latin America and Europe. Douglas Fairbanks, right? He skylarked and jumped, he rolled and tumbled. Viewers of silent era film, right? This is still a silent film, had never seen anything like Fairbanks's Zorro. One reviewer of the New York Times admitted there couldn't be another hero like Fairbanks, right? Fairbanks and his Zorro was a hero bigger, faster, and stronger than other heroes, mainly because the medium of film transformed expectations of how stories were told, right? So it's one thing to have a hero from literature. And of course, there were many, you think about the Count of Monte Cristo, for instance, or the Scarlet Pimpernel, these sort of heroes that have elements of Zorro in them. But the way in which film transformed the expectations of what the media could do really had a large impact on viewers. Movies could literally project fantasy onto screens. Fairbanks became a hero almost super. And so that really inaugurated the action adventure genre within film. But the question now, as we move on to Act 3, is what influence did Zorro have on the superhero genre created, especially with the rise of comic books in the 1930s? Well, of course, the superhero most of us look to and point to as the first comic book superhero, Superman, was created in 1938 by a dynamic duo of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Both of them would point especially to Fairbanks and his roles throughout the 1920s as elements for this kind of bigger than life hero in crafting their Man of Steel, right? In crafting Superman, doing stunts way bigger than Zorro, of course, with superpowers, but yet looking to Douglas Fairbanks and Zorro as inspiration, as a blueprint for the stories that they would craft. Now, of course, there's others. The origins of Superman and Batman, for instance, are myriad. There's many different elements, but the story of how Zorro influenced is one that hasn't been told very often, and usually ends up being a footnote. Also, Batman, Bill Finger, the co-creator of Batman, was known to paste film stills of Fairbanks doing stunts in the art direction for his Batman scripts. Right, there was comes from a fan magazine and talking about Bill Finger, and you can see that he says at the top of the screen, the stills I saw and never seen before that date were the familiar swinging poses that characterized Acro Batman, and these were of Douglas Fairbanks. And so Zorro then became a blueprint, right? I always think this is an interesting juxtaposition to show. Joaquin Murrieta, who I'll talk more about in a second, at the top, that was one of the first images of Joaquin Murrieta ever crafted, of this lithograph of him standing on a gambling table, ripping open his shirt. That looks quite a lot like Superman would look over 100 years later. And so Zorro was real, right? There's more. Beyond all the talk about Zorro being America's first superhero, which I argue in my book, Zorro matters because Zorro was real, right? Now, before you write me off as perhaps one panel short of a comic book, I want you to hear me out. Was Zorro real in the sense that a guy named Don Diego de la Vega actually lived? No, of course not. Zorro wasn't real in that sense. Zorro and his Don Diego alter ego were made up in 1919, as I said, by Pulp Fiction writer Johnston McCulley. But Zorro was real in another sense, one that makes the character relevant and compelling for our times. In the course of my research for my book on Zorro, I discovered that a real-life prototype existed for Zorro. So in the same way that Zorro was kind of a prototype and a blueprint for later comic book superheroes, Zorro himself had a prototype, and that prototype was Joaquín Murrieta, right? Johnston McCulley drew on the legend of Joaquín Murrieta in fashioning his fictional character in 1919. And it should be noted that much of the legend around Murrieta is almost as fictional as the fiction written about Zorro. Murrieta lived in the age of California gold rush, and the legend around him goes something like this. He moves from Sonora in northern Mexico up to California, right, where just really that same year there had been war between the United States and Mexico that had resulted in essentially the assimilation and the integration of California and much of the United States West into America. So Murrieta is part of the immigrants flowing into California for the gold rush. He's a prospector, and within California, Murrieta immediately comes into conflict with Anglo prospectors, right? The story goes that his wife was raped, his brother-in-law was lynched, and Murrieta is forced into a life of banditry, right? To Mexican Americans at the time in the newspapers, he's written about almost as an avenging ghost. He's ready to repay the wrongs done to his people. And one newspaper article of the time had said that he respects the Spanish-speaking population of California, meaning that he was a bandit or a social bandit, even to use the term coined by Eric Hobsbawm. He was a kind of social bandit that had a code, right? He was there not just to indiscriminately pillage the countryside, but he was there to sort of Robin Hood style, steal from the rich, rob from the rich, give to the poor. To Anglo-Americans, however, he became a scourge, a figure that was maligned, right? The famous wanted poster, which you see Douglas Fairbanks here in this GIF from a movie he did called The Gaucho. He draws on the Murrieta myth here. That really comes from Murrieta, right? A bounty was raised on Murrieta, so the story goes. And when Murrieta rides into Sacramento, he sees that the bounty is too low. He unsaddles his horse and he writes on the poster, "I will give 10,000," and signs it Joaquin, right? And so there's an interesting parallel between Zorro all the time doing his, air Z, or you can see Douglas Fairbanks in the original Mark of Zorro doing the Z on the wall. Well, that Z on the wall is kind of apropos to Murrieta signing his name Joaquin, right? Or his moniker Joaquin. Zorro's ubiquitous Z is an echo of Joaquin Murrieta's own boasting signature of his name. So in the legend about Murrieta, time runs out. The California governor sets a reward for his capture, dead or alive, and a contingent of California Rangers are mustered for the pursuit and capture of Murrieta. They claim to have killed Murrieta, they cut off his head, and then they bring it in order to claim the reward. The legend of the head of Murrieta is such that you can see in this photo in the 1970s, there were museums, Old West museums, that claimed that they still had the head of Murrieta. So whether it was actually the real Murrieta, historians, including myself, have not been able to establish. There's so much myth and legend surrounding Murrieta that it's really hard to know. It could have just been a hapless young Mexican 20-something who fit the bill and therefore lost his life and his head. But that possibility makes the decapitated head of Murrieta all the more gruesome and all the more important for our story. For indeed, whatever the truth or fiction of the actual Murrieta, Mexican Americans in the West did actually suffer under Anglo-American settlement of the West, right? There was persecution, there was racial violence, right? There was settler colonialism. One historian notes that there are at least 871 documented cases of Mexicans who were lynched in some 13 different states in the American West after the Civil War. And so the story of Murrieta, even though there's fanciful legendary elements to it, does point to a real lived story of racism and terror against Mexican Americans in the United States, in California, and throughout the West, throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Murrieta first, and later Zorro, as Murrieta's whitewashed literary offspring, preserves the real history of persecution, survival, and resistance of Latinx people in the United States. It isn't just one man, damn it. It's Zorro, as the villain says in the 1998 film, The Mask of Zorro, starring Antonio Banderas. And so what does all of this mean for us today? Well, in an age when Latinx people within the United States are again maligned, threatened, put in cages on the US border, and called foreign to the American body politic, Zorro can become a symbol of resistance. Zorro matters because after 100 years, America still needs inspiration from forgotten legends. And so Murrieta and Zorro after him reveal the rootedness of the Latinx contribution to what makes America, well, America, right? that Latinx history and experience even were part and parcel with the creation of the American superhero genre. Their experience helped birth the superhero in America. Masked Avengers who stand up for the oppressed and speak truth to power. Right? It's as plain as Zorro's famous calling card, his letter Z. All right. Thank you. That's all I have for you. And I will stop sharing.
So thank you very much, Stephen. I would like to ask you 3 questions for the moment.
Yeah, sure.
Some of the other students will have something. First of all, you say that Zorro helped create an American superhero, and the history of Latin American people helped create American culture in its complexity and melting pot question. The first question is about the difference, the territorial difference. For example, we have California as the great actor of this story, the border culture, the born of a new state between the loss of Spanish, the Mexican independence, very short presence of Mexican state in California with the war of the half of the 19th century. Then the gold rush, the news of the first part of the 20th century, that when started the myth of Zorro, the Pulp Fiction, the movie, the Hollywood history, all of this kind of thing. But what about all of these very peculiar elements of California that it's building its self-myth, its self-past, with the Mexican in Chicago or Detroit or other parts of the Mexican migration? For example, I remember in the memories of the Bishop of Oaxaca that was forced to go to California during the Mexican Revolution, that he was really impressed by the violence, the racial violence that he was talking about against Mexican people and Chilean people who were working in the mines of the gold rush in California. And what about the impact? Is there a difference in the impact of this act of the Z of Zorro in California respect of Mexican community in Chicago or Mexican community in Detroit or other in New York?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one way to think about it would also be that when we're thinking about the sort of Mexican American experience, of course we can't only see that as one thing, right? Because there are also like different generations of migration and migrational patterns that develop. And so, the 1850s, of course, in California were different than, say San Antonio in the 1920s or something like that. And then also the great wave of migration that comes in the wake of the revolution and also the Cristero Rebellion. But I think there is an interesting way in which, especially in California, even today, Murrieta takes on a symbolic sense of resistance. And I think part of that comes with the sort of Chicano activism of the 1960s and 1970s, where Murrieta's legend was again revived, but then sort of it was divorced from Zorro, right, by that time, and it becomes like this image of resistance. So there are sort of Chicano activists that talk about Murrieta, that remember Murrieta and his way of sort of being this prototype for their own resistance to racism, to segregation, et cetera, and so forth. So I do think that there is something different, of course, in the Mexican American experience in California, say, than in Chicago or Texas or wherever. But I also think that there, you know, with this sort of transnational movement of ideas and people, that that it takes on its own sort of hue based on the community that remembers that, right? So, you know, it remains to be seen how much, I guess, cultural memory that, you know, people in Chicago might attribute to Murrieta. But I do think that was a foundational trauma for many Mexican American peoples in the United States. You know, the fact that you know, their home was essentially appropriated for another nation, and then they were sort of, as the phrase goes, foreigners in their own land. So I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but those are some things that strike me, that there is a regional element to this as well. Of course, there is a local folklore character to this. A scholar like Robert McKee Irwin sees Murrieta as a kind of borderland creation, right? In that the borderlands are its own ecosystem of myths and ideas that transcend sort of just national boundaries and borders.
Okay, thank you very much. And then, for example, I was thinking of the persistences of this complexity. If you look at the docu-film like Searching for Sugar Man, about the complexity of a Mexican singer, Bob Dylan of the 60s, that to be Mexican is very complicated to be accepted in the business. Right. You have a lot of echoes of these experiences.
Right. Yeah.
The second question is about Native Americans, people that is moving around the border, across the border, that Murrieta crossed.
Right.
In the legends and in reality, probably. In the Zorro, in Macaulay was a big fan, like Fairbanks, of Teddy Roosevelt, of the Manifest Destiny, of the myth of civilization, of the white civilization of the Americas. And during the first decades of the 20th century, you have this link with a contradictory relation with the image of Spanish blood. Don Diego de la Vega is a pure Spanish, obviously. Murrieta was probably a mestizo with something indigenous. We don't know exactly. But for one side, you have the black legend of the Spanish colonialism of Nueva España, and on the other side, you have this fascination for a mythical Spain, between music, architecture, etc., etc. But in the history of Zorro, I haven't read the Macaulay original, the Curse of Capistrano, but usually the Native Americans are part of the oppressed people, the Frails, the Catholic congregation represent actors are working together with the Native Americans. Zorro is defending the Native American and the peones mexicanos. So there is a sort of big contradiction between this Spanish blood myth and, on the other side, the relation with the Indians, with the Native Americans. And in the age, you talk about the birth of a nation, the role of Griffith, the friendship between Griffith and Fairbanks, in a place where the big enemies was the mestizo people. The mestizo people was the big fear for this kind of reconstruction of American ideals. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because oftentimes one of the things that people ask is like, so if Murrieta is a prototype or a sort of precursor, or that his legends feed into Zorro, on the one hand, Murrieta looks very different than Zorro does, right?
Yeah.
Because, Zorro, as you said, is of, Spanish aristocracy, the sort of blue blood of Spain, right? Sort of unsullied by any mixture of indigenous people, or back in Spain, of the quote unquote Moors, right? And so part of this is one of the things that I really tried to do in the book was figure out how we go from Murrieta to Zorro. And really it's a path of, 70 years of, a shorthand way to say it is essentially whitewashing of Murrieta. And that whitewashing happens very early on with for instance, the novel by a Native American author. John Roland Ridge was he was half Cherokee. He was from the Southeast, was involved in sort of the problems with Indian removal. He goes out west as a journalist, and he learns of this myth of Murrieta. By that time, it was 1853. He collects the legends. He begins to mythologize about Murrieta. And with every retelling, Murrieta's social class kind of heightens, and also his ethnicity becomes more and more white over time. And part of this is explained by an American reading audience, right? They want a hero with whom they can identify. And so even though Spain is foreign and the United States has its own problems with the Black legend in Spain, there was a process by which the Spanish Black legend was being transformed, especially by people interested in tourism, to to make Spain a place of romance, a place of low guitars, of pretty senoritas, all this kind of this talk, and so much so that by the early 20th century there had really been a Spanish fantasy myth installed in Southern California. And the hero that could fit in that, even though he wasn't yet quote unquote American, he was the whitest person in that story, because compared to him, you could have the mestizos, you could have the peones, you could have the poor Mexicans with whom Zorro could defend. But ultimately, Zorro was the white hero within that story. And so Murrieta, so much so, there are several books at the turn of the 20th century where Murrieta all of a sudden is fighting on the side of the Americans against the Mexicans for statehood, right? And so it's a total inverse or inversion of the myth, right? All of his sort of recalcitrance, his resistance to American annexation is flipped the other way. And so Zorro, Murrieta first, and then Zorro becomes a hero for American annexation. And so Zorro has this really kind of odd relationship with especially Native American history or ethnicity. But what's interesting is the actual history of Los Angeles was not one of Spanish blue blood, right? The original founders of Los Angeles, outside of the few Spanish friars that were there, the original citizens were all, Afro-Mexicans. They were mestizos, or they were indigenous people, right? There was no sort of original sort of Spanish fantasy. That was something that was created to provide California with an appealing location or destination for tourism. El Camino Real, the King's Highway, was a pure sort of real fabrication. It was just a sort of a dusty cart road between the different missions. And then it was made to be this this royal road, right? Come see the El Camino Real, or come see, all of this is the rise of Hollywood built into the architecture, yada yada, et cetera, and so forth. So I could go on and about that, but I'll just sort of cut it off there.
Okay, and the third is about if we move to the another stage of the history of Zorro, the Cold War years. You talk about the Disney adventures, the idea of Disney to buy the rights of Zorro, start a TV through ABC, a TV series that was a phenomenal success, a worldwide success that came in France, Italy, big parts of Europe, Argentina, and other parts of the world. So in the culture of the 50s, you talk about, you made a very interesting part of your works is the mix between classical historiographical work in the archives and works with oral history and with imaginary and picking pieces of various places. But it's really interesting in the age of after the Three Caballeros, when Walt Disney is a sort of a part of the good neighbor policy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on one side, and on the other side the Cold War after the end of the 30s and the 50s of the exportation of the American way of life model through his productions. Zorro, do you think that can be used inside the American model as a prototype, but also exported in France, for example, or in Italy, where he had a huge success, to connect with other European models? For example, when Disney styled to rebuild legend and tradition, for example, Pinocchio from Italy, Alice in Wonderland from England, Grimm stories from Germany. Zorro has something sort of transferred from the old ancient roots of European roots in the Americas, the new American of the Cold War and the American way of life, and the new friendship with the Europe of the Cold War years.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. What it kind of made me think of also, though, is so if Walt Disney is sort of taking this Spanish fantasy that's been transplanted into the United States and then sort of exporting it back to Europe, there were counterpoints to that, right? And the biggest one would be in Spain, a series of books and then also films called El Coyote, and he was a character that looked exactly like Zorro, except for he was called El Coyote, the coyote, and in that. Zorro is actually within the gold rush era, and so he has to fight against the Americans, right? So that's one. And so if but that's probably more by the 1960s, etc. That you see. All right. Somehow I was muted. But yeah, no, I think there is this sort of Cold War export. You see it pop up throughout films.
Oh.
All right. You see it somehow transported throughout films and comics, especially in some you see Zorro fighting against the Tsarist, Russia, and so you do see these Cold War themes of freedom, of sort of hero, of fighting for freedom, right? Those kind of those kind of issues being exported with Disney's Zorro, no doubt.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I don't know if anyone in our student group, Matteo Molino, please. Matteo, if you want to.
Oh, yes. Okay, now I can. I wonder if or how the touristic attractions about Zorro in the southwest area of the United States are organized, because I know that this touristic attraction has just been born, and this is described in your book, Professor Andy's.
Great, thank you. Great question. I think a couple of things come to my mind. One is there, so in 1898 there is the war, the Spanish American War, right? The United States basically goes to war with Spain, but over the next 2 decades, you see especially states within the United States, Florida, Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, begin to say, there was actually something really important about the Spanish settlement of the West. The Spanish settlement of the West helped introduce civilization and Christianity into the sort of pagan Native American lands, right? And so they began to resuscitate Spain and the legacy of Spain within the United States by talking about civilization and Christianity, how those two things went together. And they could say that when a statue was put up to Christopher Columbus, you have the Chamber of Commerce of Los Angeles going out to Washington, D.C., saying, you know what, it wasn't the Pilgrims that helped introduce Christianity and civilization. It was the Spanish friars, right, who came and built civilization and Christianity. And so they should be seen as part of our heritage, part of our DNA in what makes America America. And so that's the foundation on which a lot of these touristic elements went. There was a resuscitation of the memory of Father Junipero Serra, right? One of the first priests or missionaries that came and built the Spanish missions, right, throughout California. And then you have the creation of the automobile, right? So the creation of the automobile in the first part really makes Southern California a possibility, right? With the automobile, it's not just dozens of visitors that can come to Los Angeles on trains, but it's people can drive. And then more and more you see people not just coming to California, but then staying, building homes, right? And there was housing and planning that said that certain kind of architecture should be what is preferred, and that was the Spanish Revival architecture. Mary Pickford, for instance, spoke to several housing associations saying that there should be ordinances that mandated only Spanish Revival architecture, so that the sort of from an aesthetic point of view, it would only be Spanish Revival architecture. And from there, it was, this is our heritage. Our heritage is Spanish heritage, and and so those are some of the foundations on which that infrastructure or the narrative that tourism used to get going within Los Angeles, within California. And of course, you have the rise of Hollywood to boot, that acts as a great propaganda films for tourism, right? Shot in California, sunny climes, come to California, right? Here's this movie, et cetera, and so forth. So I hope that answers some of your question.
Yes, I was pretty satisfied by the answer, but there is some resistance to this movement of resuscitation of the Spanish memory, as you were saying, because I remember in 2015 when the Pope rendered Junipero Serra a saint, and in that day the statue of the saint in California was beheaded by the natives because Padre Serra was very violent.
That's a big issue. On the other side, you have also Mexican Americans and Chicanos in California that are returning for tourism around the Father Kino on the other side of the border. That's something really interesting. And in the book, you also talk about the story of a little village, Trincheras in North Mexico, that is inventing the tradition of the presence of Zorro.
Right. Yeah, it's a fantastic situation where you have this little town that essentially says, no, Zorro was born here, and sort of buys into sort of the tourist possibilities that Zorro could provide. So they have this old sort of centuries old hotel that they have the legend written on the wall. They have an actor that comes out at night and retells how he was born in that very hotel, and then he went up to California later, and I think that's a fascinating way that these sort of legends, stories have a transnational aspect, and also one carried by economic interest, because this story is only appropriated by this small town, by this hotel, because they think that it will draw more tourists. It drew me. I wouldn't have stopped there if it hadn't been the Zorro Hotel, right? So yeah, there. But yeah, like I think who owns the story of Zorro? I think it's been used for so long to pad the pockets of American media companies that I'm all for a reappropriation of that story for a small Mexican hotel, right? So
that's curious. And it's for American tourists or Mexican tourists?
I think there were quite there was a mixture. There was definitely what seemed to be sort of folks, Mexican folks from DF, from Mexico City, that had come up because there's some fishing there. It's close to the Copper Canyon, and so people can ride the train there and stuff like that. So there are some tourist possibilities that attract not just Americans, but I think their clientele are sort of Americans coming through.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So what about the women role? So there is in Zorro a female main character who represents the women's situation in this period. What about it?
That's a great question. Because in the original Macaulay story, of course, Lolita Pulido, the original sort of love interest for Zorro, it is the trope of the damsel in distress that needs saving by the sort of macho hero, right? But even in that story, I would say there, in Johnston Macaulay's telling of it, there is a chapter where Lolita manages to escape, right? She jumps on a horse and she rides out, right? And so they show her as somewhat of this sort of a character with agency, not just a damsel in distress. But throughout the history of Zorro, the films, especially, the character, especially women, play a certain kind of stereotypical role, right? They are the damsel in distress. Perhaps the Catherine Zeta-Jones character has a little bit of the Latina sort of the fiery Latina, right? Who that has to sort of can fight and sword fight herself. But in the main, most depictions of women within the Zorro myth are quite misogynist and quite stereotyped. However, that is changing, especially with the 2005 novel by Isabel Allende, Chilean novelist, now lives in California. And in that, the story is actually told from the perspective of one of the females in the story, about essentially her friend, who is Don Diego, etc. And in that telling, Don Diego's mother is not Spanish, but is an actual historical figure, Toy Purina, which was one of the indigenous women from a matriarchal tribe in California that attacked the Spaniards, right? And so Don Diego's mother is actually an indigenous woman, and his father is a Spanish aristocrat. And so that makes Zorro a mestizo in Isabel Allende's telling. And so that is the sort of direction, I think, a positive direction that Zorro is beginning to take, that the women in Zorro can not only just hold their own in sort of stereotypical fashion, but they have their own story to tell about who Zorro is, and also what Zorro means. Of course, in the comics in many of the Zorro comics, it's a mixed bag, right? Many of the women characters in some of the Zorro comics are also kind of sexually stereotyped. The most sort of classic that comes to mind is Lady Rawhide, right, where she's dressed up in this sort of superhero-esque costume, but it looks like something out of sort of Victoria's Secrets, or this sort of very showing lots of the female body and stuff like that. So that's a great question, and I think one that needs to be taken up. And so I think I was able to touch on it some, but I think it's a subject in its own right that needs more work on it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So, others?
Yes, I do have a question. Good morning. So if I understood well, there was a period when Zorro went through a whitewashing phase, right? But apart from the American audience, who I assume had no problem regarding this matter, or maybe a little problem, apart from them, if there was, how did the Latino audience react?
It's a brilliant question. It's a great question. Because so I'll give one of my answer sort of in the form of an anecdote, because I think, when you think about filmic or media representations of Latino people, there weren't many, right? And when there were, oftentimes they fit into certain categories that I talked about, like the bandit, or the Latin lover, or the fiery sort of female sex pot, or the sort of nun-like, Catholic, very Catholic religious woman, right? And so these stereotypes were everywhere. You can see them in film and movies throughout the 20th century in the United States. Zorro, ticks off a lot of those boxes, right? He was a Latin lover. He was also a bandit. Oftentimes the women, as I've said, were either sort of the nun or the whore. But at the same time, there are a couple of important scholars that have written about this. One in particular is a guy named Frederick Luis Aldama, and he is a professor at Ohio State University. And what he talks about is the way in which that even though there are these stereotypical representations of characters such as Zorro coming out, that there is a really creative way in which Latino people and other, ethnic minorities in the United States are able to metabolize these images and then actually reinterpret them through the lens of their experience in order to tell better stories. So one of the guys in my book that I interview, a comic artist named Javier Hernandez, who does his own independent comics called El Muerto, and I recommend his comics, talks about growing up in the 1970s and 80s and being like, yeah, Zorro is Mexican, right? Because even though he was, Spanish background, he was the only guy that he felt like looked like him, right? And so he was able to identify with Zorro in a way that even though we look back and we can unpack the sort of faulty representation and the whitewashing, as you said, that takes place of that character, his vision of Zorro was something that was inspiring to him. And so much so that his character, El Muerto, the alter ego is called Don Diego de la Muerte, right? Don Diego de la Muerte, as opposed to Don Diego de la Vega, right? And so there's ways in which Zorro has influenced a generation, especially of comic book artists, even though despite Zorro being whitewashed, despite Zorro portraying these sort of stereotypical images, these comics creators metabolize Zorro in such a way as to see something creative and something important in it representing them. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect sense. Thank you.
Yes, and thanks to your books, we also discovered that Guy Williams, the classical Disney actor of Zorro, was Italian.
Yeah, that's right.
Was Armando Catalano from Bronx, and won the part with a Mexican actor.
Right. Yeah. Well, that guy. Yeah, his story is very interesting, and especially the ways in which, he felt like he had to change his name from, Armando Catalano to Guy Williams, but then Guy Williams, becomes a Spanish character, right? So like, it's a very complicated and very sort of confusing way in which race and ethnicity gets expressed on screen within the 20th century, right? Even to the point of Walt Disney saying, no, that's too much of an accent. Or no, that's not enough of an accent. You have, like it was this. And so what I talk about is there's a way in which it was a curated ethnicity, right? In the same way that a museum might be curated, there was a curation of ethnic portrayals on screen at the time.
So, another last question.
Yes, mine isn't really a question, it's more so of a fun side note, I guess, because when you said that, when you talked about Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford coming to Europe on their honeymoon, I love history of Italian cuisine, and they're the one that discovered fettuccine Alfredo and brought them to America, because they went to Rome and they tried a restaurant that is the one that invented fettuccine Alfredo. And so they were so surprised about the recipe that they tried to reply or to copy it when they went back to America. So I don't know, I thought it was fun.
That's great. And And obviously they failed to replicate it because
Yeah,
I can't get any good fettuccine Alfredo here in the United States, you know. So
yeah, but it's very easy. Actually, it's just butter and Parmesan, so it's quite easy.
Thank you. I thank you for telling me that. That's
You're welcome.
Yes, that's curious. Yesterday I was talking with my mom, and she told me that she has a photograph of my grandfather, the father of my mother, with Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford during Mille Miglia. Mille Miglia was a sort of car competition around Italy, and my grandfather was working for Champions with the cars. So we have this photo of the three of them. That, I didn't have time to take the photo and scan and put here.
Well, you have to send it to me later, Massimo.
Yes, I'll send you tomorrow. And I don't know exactly the year, but it was typical because it was part of the promoting of Mille Miglia. I have stars from the movies from Hollywood that were coming here in Italy, like today, as the stars that come to the Venice Festival or something like this. So I think we can thank Stephen because his speech today was very rich, interesting, and the book Zorro Shadow is really an interesting book because it's a cinematic book, with a journey. It's very funny to read, but it's also deep historical research, very serious, and so I hope that other historians will seek this this kind of description with other characters. So thank you very much, Stephen, and I hope that we can organize something similar in the future. And see you soon.
Yeah, grazie mille. Thank you so much. This was great fun. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone has a good evening there in Italy.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye, Stephen.
Bye. Bye.